The cemetery was a different kind of quiet than the cathedral had been, where the church had buzzed with whispered conversations and barely contained curiosity. Arlington National Cemetery possessed the profound silence that came from being surrounded by thousands of stories that would never be fully told. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond the gates. But here, among the white headstones that stretched in perfect rows toward the horizon, the noise of the everyday world felt impossibly far away. I walked behind Marcus's casket with my parents, but the dynamic between us had shifted so fundamentally that we might as well have been strangers. My father kept glancing at me sideways, as if he were trying to reconcile this new information about his daughter with 34 years of assumptions about who I was and what I did with my life. My mother maintained her composure with the rigid discipline that had served her well through decades of political life. But I could see the questions burning behind her eyes, questions that would have to wait until we were safely away from public scrutiny. The honor guard that accompanied us to the gravesite was larger than the standard military funeral detail. Word of what had happened in the cathedral had spread quickly through the networks that governed official Washington, and people who understood the significance of a classified citation being read publicly had made arrangements to attend the burial. I recognized several faces from briefings I had given in secure conference rooms, officials whose names appeared on documents that would remain classified for decades, but who now looked at me with open acknowledgement instead of the careful anonymity that usually characterized our interactions. General Patricia Hawkins was among them, a woman whose career had been built on managing the intersection between military operations and civilian intelligence. She had been my direct superior for 3 years during the development of the threat prediction protocols that were now standard across all branches of the armed forces. Seeing her here, in her dress uniform with its rows of ribbons that told the story of a lifetime of service, was both validating and surreal. In our professional relationship, rank and protocol had always maintained a careful distance between us. Today, she nodded to me with something that looked remarkably like pride. The burial service was shorter than the cathedral ceremony, focused on the ancient rituals that had sent soldiers to their rest for generations. But even these familiar traditions felt different now. When the honor guard folded Marcus's burial flag with their crisp, synchronized movements, I understood that they were performing this ceremony not just for him, but for both of us. When the bugler played taps, the mournful notes seemed to acknowledge all the silent sacrifices that military families made, including the ones that could never be publicly recognized. As the flag was presented to my parents, I caught my father's eye for the first time since the revelation in the cathedral. The confusion was still there. The fundamental disorientation that came from having your understanding of reality completely reorganized in the space of an afternoon. But there was something else now, something that looked like the beginning of respect. It was tentative and uncertain, built on information he didn't fully understand, but it was real. The final ritual was the one I had been dreading most. In military funerals, it was traditional for family members to place flowers or small personal items on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. It was the last chance to say goodbye, the final moment of connection between the living and the dead. I had avoided thinking about this part of the service because I didn't know what I could possibly say to Marcus that would encompass everything that had been revealed today. But as I approached his casket, carrying a single white rose that had been provided by the funeral director, I realized that the words weren't necessary. Marcus had known. Somehow, in ways that I still didn't fully understand, my brother had died knowing that his sister was worthy of respect, that her work mattered, that she had been protecting him even as he was protecting others. The revelation in the cathedral hadn't been about informing my family of something new. It had been about acknowledging something that should have been recognized years ago. I placed the rose on the polished wood of his casket and whispered the words that I had been carrying for decades, words that had never found the right moment until now. "I'm sorry it took so long for them to understand, Marcus. I hope you always knew that I saw you as the hero you were, even when I couldn't tell you that I was trying to be one too." The burial concluded with the traditional honors, and slowly the crowd began to disperse. Military personnel moved with the efficient purpose that marked all their actions, while civilians lingered in the uncertain way of people who weren't sure what was expected of them in this situation. My parents stood near the gravesite, clearly waiting for me to join them, but for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't in any hurry to return to their orbit. General Hawkins approached me as I stood contemplating the fresh mound of earth that marked my brother's final resting place. She had removed her hat, and the late afternoon sun highlighted the gray streaks in her hair that spoke to decades of carrying responsibilities that most people could never imagine. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth that had always been present in our professional relationship, but had been kept carefully contained within appropriate boundaries. "Sophia," she said, using my first name for what I thought might be the first time in our acquaintance, "I want you to know how proud I am of what happened today. You've spent years doing work that deserved recognition, and I'm glad that your family finally understands the kind of person they've had in their midst all along." The word "finally" carried weight that went beyond simple timing. General Hawkins had been present for briefings where my analysis had redirected entire military operations, had seen firsthand the way my recommendations were implemented at the highest levels of command. She understood better than most the disconnect between my professional reputation and my family's perception of my worth. "I never expected anything like this," I admitted, gesturing toward the cemetery where the last of the honor guard was completing their final duties. I knew Marcus was proud to serve, and I was proud of the work I was doing, but I never imagined that anyone would see fit to connect the two publicly. She smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression. "The decision to declassify your citation came from very high up, Sophia. There were people who felt that your brother's death provided an opportunity to acknowledge civilian contributions to defense in a way that usually isn't possible. You've become something of a symbol for all the people who serve their country in ways that can't be publicly celebrated." A symbol? The idea was both flattering and terrifying. I had spent my entire career in the shadows, working on projects that officially didn't exist, solving problems that the public would never know had threatened them. The thought of becoming a public face for that kind of service was overwhelming, but I could see the logic behind it. In an age when military and civilian roles were increasingly intertwined, when the most important battles were fought with algorithms and data analysis rather than guns and bombs, there was value in showing that heroism could take many forms. But even as I understood the reasoning, I felt a pull toward the quiet anonymity that had shaped my professional life. The recognition was gratifying, but the work itself had always been its own reward.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The satisfaction came from knowing that systems I had designed were functioning properly, that threats I had identified were being neutralized, that people like Marcus could focus on their missions without worrying about dangers they couldn't see. "General," I said carefully, "I appreciate everything that happened today, and I'm grateful that my family finally understands something about the work I do. But I hope this doesn't mean that my role in ongoing projects will be compromised. I've always been most effective when I could operate without public attention." Her expression grew more serious, and I could see her shifting back into the professional mode that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the defense establishment. "That's something we'll need to discuss in detail, obviously. Today was about honoring your brother and acknowledging your service in a way that your family could understand. But you're right to be concerned about operational security. We'll need to find a balance between recognition and effectiveness." As we spoke, I noticed that my parents were still waiting near the gravesite, clearly expecting me to rejoin them for whatever post-funeral gathering they had planned. But for the first time in my memory, I felt no obligation to automatically fall in line with their expectations. The revelation of the afternoon had changed the fundamental dynamic between us, and I was still processing what that might mean for our relationship going forward. My father approached us with the cautious deference he usually reserved for high-ranking military officials he encountered in his political work. He had clearly recognized General Hawkins, though I wasn't sure if he understood the nature of our professional relationship. When he spoke, his voice carried a formality that was very different from his usual paternal tone. "General Hawkins, I want to thank you for your presence at my son's service today. And I want to apologize for my family's ignorance about my daughter's work. It's clear that we have severely underestimated her contributions to national security, and I hope you understand that our lack of recognition came from ignorance rather than any lack of appreciation for her service." The apology was everything I had wanted to hear from him for decades. But hearing it now, in this context, it felt oddly hollow. He was apologizing not because he had come to a new understanding of my worth as his daughter, but because military officials he respected had told him that my work was important. The recognition was contingent on external validation, rather than any fundamental shift in how he saw me as a person. General Hawkins received his apology with diplomatic grace, but I could see in her expression that she understood the subtext of what was happening. She had worked in Washington long enough to recognize the difference between genuine respect and political calculation, and she knew that my father's newfound appreciation was still filtered through his understanding of power and status, rather than any real comprehension of who I was or what my life had been like. "Senator Hartwell," she replied, "your daughter has been one of our most valuable assets for years. The work she does is necessarily invisible, which makes it easy for even well-intentioned people to underestimate its importance. I hope today's revelations will help your family understand that service to country can take many forms, and that all of them deserve recognition and respect." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but I found myself listening with the detached attention I usually reserved for briefings on topics outside my area of expertise. My father and General Hawkins were discussing my life and work as if I weren't standing right there, as if the decisions about my future recognition and role were theirs to make rather than mine. It was a familiar dynamic, one that had shaped most of my interactions with authority figures throughout my career. But today it felt different. Today I felt like I had the right to insert myself into conversations about my own life. "If I may interrupt," I said, surprising both of them with the firmness in my voice, "I think any decisions about my future involvement in public recognition should wait until I've had time to process everything that happened today. This has been overwhelming, and I need to think carefully about how to balance acknowledgement with operational effectiveness." Both General Hawkins and my father looked at me with expressions that suggested they weren't used to having their conversations redirected by the person they were discussing. But there was something different in their looks now, a recognition that I had earned the right to be heard in ways that went beyond simple politeness. My mother joined us then, her composure as perfect as ever, despite the emotional turbulence of the day. When she spoke, her voice carried the diplomatic skills that had served her well as a senator's wife, but there was an undercurrent of genuine confusion that she couldn't completely mask. "Sophia, dear," she said, "I think we need to have a family conversation about everything that came to light today. Your father and I realize that we've been operating under some serious misconceptions about your work, and we'd like to understand better how we can support you going forward." Support. The word was loaded with implications that I wasn't sure any of us were ready to unpack. For 34 years, my parents' idea of support had consisted primarily of polite interest in my life, followed by gentle suggestions that I find something more conventional to do with my time. The notion that they might now want to actively support work they didn't understand, simply because military officials had told them it was important, felt more patronizing than validating. But as I looked at their faces, I realized that their confusion was genuine. They truly didn't understand what had happened today, didn't know how to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the person who had been publicly honored by some of the most senior military officials in the country. They were trying to do the right thing, even if they weren't sure what that meant. Sophia, Dad, I said, choosing my words carefully, I appreciate that you want to understand better, and I'm willing to explain what I can within the constraints of security regulations. But I need you to understand that today wasn't about revealing something new about me. Today was about acknowledging something that has always been true, something that I hoped you would see and appreciate without needing external validation. The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of decades of misunderstanding and missed connections. My parents exchanged a look that seemed to encompass years of conversations about their disappointing daughter who had chosen such an incomprehensible path through life. My father was the first to respond, his voice carrying a humility that I had rarely heard from him. Sophia, I think we're beginning to understand that we never really tried to learn about your work because we assumed it wasn't as important as the things we were familiar with. That was our mistake, and it's one we'd like to correct if you're willing to help us do so. It was the closest thing to a genuine apology I had ever received from him, and it carried more weight than all the official recognition of the afternoon. This wasn't about political calculation or social obligation. This was about a father trying to understand his daughter, perhaps for the first time in both their adult lives. General Hawkins, sensing that this was becoming a private family moment, excused herself with a reminder that we would need to schedule follow-up meetings about the security implications of the day's revelations. As she walked away, her bearing erect and purposeful, even in grief, I felt a connection to the military community that went beyond my professional relationships.
These were people who understood service, who recognized sacrifice, who knew that heroism could be quiet and invisible and still worthy of the highest honors. The sun was beginning to set as my parents and I stood together beside Marcus's grave, three people who were related by blood but had been strangers in all the ways that mattered. The day had changed everything and nothing. I was still their daughter, still a government contractor working on classified projects, still someone whose life operated according to rules and obligations they couldn't fully comprehend. But the dynamic had shifted in ways that might make connection possible for the first time. I loved Marcus, I said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between us. I was proud of him, and I understood that his service was visible and celebrated in ways that mine never could be. I never resented that, but I did hope that someday you might see that what I was doing mattered too, even if you couldn't understand the details. My mother reached out and took my hand, something she hadn't done since I was a child. Her fingers were cold in the autumn air, but her grip was firm and steady. We see it now, sweetheart. We may not understand it completely, but we see it. And we're proud of you, even if we're 30 years too late in saying so. The tears that came then were not the sharp, bitter tears of grief, but something softer and more healing. They were tears for all the years of distance, for all the missed opportunities for connection, for all the ways we had failed to understand each other despite sharing the same blood and the same fundamental values. But they were also tears of relief, of finally being seen and acknowledged by the people whose opinion had mattered most to me for my entire life. We stood there together as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless rows of white headstones that marked the resting places of America's honored dead. Marcus was part of that honored company now, his sacrifice officially recognized and permanently recorded. But so, in a way that I was still learning to understand, was I. The drive back to my parents' house was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the tense, uncomfortable quiet that had characterized so many of our family interactions over the years. This was the silence of people who were processing new information, trying to reorganize their understanding of relationships that had seemed fixed and immutable just hours before. When we arrived at the house that had been my childhood home, I found myself seeing it with different eyes. The hallway that had always showcased Marcus's achievements looked different when I understood that my own accomplishments had been equally worthy of recognition, even if they had never been suitable for public display. The family photos that had always made me feel like an outsider now seemed like incomplete records of a story that was more complex than any of us had realized. My parents went through the motions of hosting the post-funeral reception that had been planned for family and close friends, but the atmosphere was subdued and thoughtful rather than social. People who had known our family for years kept glancing at me with curious expressions, clearly having heard something about what had happened at the funeral, but not understanding the full implications. Senator Matthews, my father's longtime colleague and friend, approached me with the kind of careful, diplomatic courtesy that politicians used when they weren't sure of someone's status or importance. When he spoke, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Sophia, I have to admit that what happened today has left all of us with a lot of questions. Your father has always been proud of your work, of course, but I don't think any of us understood the true scope of your contributions to national defense. Would you be willing to help those of us who work on defense appropriations understand better how civilian contractors like yourself fit into the larger picture? It was a reasonable request, and one that I probably should have expected. The revelation of my work would have implications that went beyond my family relationships, affecting budget decisions and policy priorities that these people would be voting on in the coming months. But the idea of becoming a public advocate for classified programs felt overwhelming after a lifetime of operational invisibility. Senator Matthews, I replied carefully, I appreciate your interest, and I understand that today's revelations raise questions that affect your work in Congress. But I hope you'll understand that most of what I do remains classified, and I'll need to work with my superiors to determine what information can be shared and in what contexts. He nodded with the understanding of someone who had dealt with classification issues throughout his political career. Of course, of course. I just wanted you to know that there are people in Congress who are very interested in making sure that civilian contributions to defense are properly supported and funded. Today opened a lot of eyes to the importance of work that most of us had never considered. As the evening wore on, I found myself in dozens of similar conversations, each one a reminder that my professional life was no longer completely separate from my personal and family identity. People who had known me as the senator's quiet daughter were trying to reconcile that image with someone who had been publicly honored by the military's highest officials. The cognitive dissonance was visible in their faces, and I realized that I was probably experiencing the same disorientation in reverse. But the most important conversation of the evening came late, after most of the guests had gone home and the house had returned to something approaching normal quiet. My parents and I sat in the living room, where I had spent so many childhood evenings feeling like an outsider in my own family. But tonight, the dynamic was completely different. My father spoke first, his voice carrying a weariness that went beyond the exhaustion of a long and emotionally difficult day. Sophia, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. All these years that we thought you were just working in some anonymous government office, were you aware of how important your work actually was? Did you know that what you were doing was saving lives and preventing conflicts? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. I had known, of course, that my work had real-world implications, that the systems I designed and the analysis I provided were being used to make decisions that affected military operations around the world. But I had never quantified it in the stark terms that Colonel Morrison used at the funeral, had never calculated the number of lives that had been saved or conflicts that had been prevented. I thought about it more abstractly, as solving complex problems that needed to be solved for reasons that were important, but not always clearly defined. My mother leaned forward in her chair, her expression more intent than I had seen her all day. But you must have had some sense of pride in what you were accomplishing, some understanding that you were making a real difference in the world.
Why didn't you ever try to help us understand how meaningful your work was? The question cut to the heart of decades of family dynamics, and answering it required a level of honesty that felt risky, even after everything that had been revealed. But I realized that this might be the only opportunity I would ever have to explain the choices I had made and the distance I had maintained. Mom, I tried for years to help you understand that my work mattered to me, that it was challenging and rewarding and worthy of respect. But every time I tried to explain what I was doing, you would respond by suggesting that I should find something more normal, more conventional, more like what other people did with their lives. After a while, I stopped trying to bridge that gap because it was clear that you valued things I couldn't provide and couldn't understand things I could. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. We all knew that what I was describing was accurate, that the patterns of dismissal and misunderstanding had been established years ago and had been reinforced through countless interactions over the decades. But acknowledging the pattern was the first step toward changing it. My father rubbed his forehead with the gesture he used when he was wrestling with particularly complex political problems. I think we got so focused on supporting Marcus in the kind of career we understood that we never learned how to support you in the kind of career that was right for you. We weren't trying to diminish your achievements, but I can see now that our lack of understanding had that effect. It was more insight than I had ever expected from him, and more acknowledgement of responsibility than he usually took for interpersonal problems. Politicians were trained to deflect blame and find diplomatic solutions to conflicts, but this felt like genuine self-reflection rather than strategic positioning. "The thing that hurts the most," I said, feeling brave enough to be completely honest, "is that I always assumed you thought less of me because I wasn't like Marcus, because I couldn't be the kind of child you were proud of. Today I learned that I was the kind of child you could be proud of if you had known what to look for." The tears that came then were shared by all three of us, the release of decades of accumulated misunderstanding and missed connection. We sat there in the living room where I had spent so many lonely evenings, finally talking to each other with the honesty that should have characterized our relationship all along. When we finally went to our respective bedrooms late that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The recognition at Marcus's funeral had been gratifying, but this conversation with my parents felt like the real resolution. We were still figuring out how to relate to each other as adults who finally saw each other clearly, but for the first time in my memory, that process felt possible rather than futile. The next morning brought phone calls from reporters, interview requests from defense journals, and meeting invitations from congressional staffers who wanted to understand the implications of civilian contributions to military effectiveness. I spent the day navigating a media attention that I had never sought and wasn't sure I wanted, but I also spent it with a newfound sense of my own worth and place in the world. Marcus was gone, and nothing could change that fundamental reality. But his death had revealed truths about our family and our individual contributions that had been hidden for decades. In honoring his sacrifice, we had finally learned to honor each other. The invisible sister had become visible, not just to the military officials who had always known my worth, but to the family whose recognition I had always craved. The funeral was over, but the real work of rebuilding our relationships was just beginning. And for the first time in my memory, I felt confident that it was work worth doing, that the connections we were forming were based on truth rather than assumption, on respect rather than obligation, on love that was finally informed by understanding. The funeral director's voice was soft, almost apologetic, as he blocked my path to the front row. "I'm sorry, miss, but these seats are reserved for immediate family only." His words hung in the humid Georgia air like a death sentence. I stood there in my simple black dress, watching as strangers in expensive suits filed past me into the seats that should have been mine by birthright. The St. Matthew's Cathedral was packed wall to wall. Every pew groaned under the weight of dignitaries, politicians, and military brass who had come to pay their respects to Captain Marcus Hartwell, war hero, decorated Marine, golden son of the Hartwell dynasty. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow shadows across his flag-draped coffin, and all I could think about was how he would have loved this spectacle. My mother, Eleanor Hartwell, glided past me in her designer morning attire, her face a perfect mask of dignified grief. She didn't acknowledge my existence. My father, Senator William Hartwell, followed behind her with his political entourage, his silver hair gleaming under the cathedral lights. To them, I was just another face in the crowd, another mourner who had come to pay their respects to their precious son. But I wasn't just another mourner. I was his sister. I was Sophia Hartwell, and I had been invisible to this family for 34 years. The cathedral's organ began its mournful song, and I found myself relegated to a folding chair in the very back, squeezed between a junior staffer from my father's office and an old woman I'd never seen before. From here, Marcus looked so small, so far away, reduced to nothing more than a distant flag and flowers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even in death, my brother managed to keep me at arm's length. Growing up as Sophia Hartwell had been like living in a house made of mirrors that refused to reflect my image. Every surface in our Savannah mansion showed Marcus's face, his achievements, his bright future stretching endlessly ahead. The morning light would catch his swimming trophies on the mantelpiece, sending golden reflections dancing across walls that held his academic awards, his military academy acceptance letter, and his commissioned officer photograph. I existed in the spaces between these reflections, a shadow child in a house built for someone else's glory. Our childhood home was a monument to Marcus before he was even dead to be memorialized. The main staircase displayed his journey from Little League MVP to high school valedictorian to Marine Corps officer in chronological order, each photograph professionally framed and lit like artifacts in a museum. Visitors would pause at each image, commenting on his strong jaw, his confident smile, and his obvious destiny for greatness. I would watch from the kitchen doorway as my parents guided these tours of their son's magnificence, their voices filled with the kind of pride that made their eyes shine. My own achievements lived in a cardboard shoebox in the attic, labeled in my father's careful handwriting, Sophia's Academic Things. The dismissive casualness of that label had stung for years. Academic things. As if my summa cum laude graduation from Georgia Tech, my master's degree in aerospace engineering from Stanford, my doctoral dissertation on advanced propulsion systems were hobbies rather than accomplishments. As if the Young Engineer of the Year award I'd received at 26 was equivalent to a participation trophy in a children's soccer league. I remembered the night I'd brought that award home, the heavy crystal catching the light as I carried it into my father's study. He'd been reading defense appropriations bills, his reading glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in the political machinery that governed his world. I'd cleared my throat, held up the award, started to explain what it meant, the competition I'd faced, the recognition it represented in my field. He'd looked up briefly, given me a distracted smile, and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Make sure your mother sees it. She'll want to put it somewhere safe." Then his attention had returned to his papers, dismissing both me and my achievement with the casual efficiency of a man who had more important things to consider. The award had indeed been put somewhere safe. It had joined the growing collection in that cardboard box, safe from view, safe from recognition, safe from mattering to anyone who shared my last name. The pastor at Marcus's funeral was speaking now about courage and sacrifice, his voice echoing through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. He painted a picture of my brother as a man who had lived without fear, who had charged headfirst into danger to protect his fellow Marines, who embodied everything noble about the American spirit. The congregation murmured their agreement, a choreographed symphony of grief and admiration that made my chest tighten with familiar loneliness. Marcus had been brave. There was no questioning that. The silver star on his dress uniform wasn't ceremonial. It represented actions in the Battle of Marja that had saved the lives of 6 Marines trapped by enemy fire. I'd read the citation online, printed it out, kept it in my desk drawer at work where I could look at it during the long hours I spent designing systems that would keep other people's brothers safe. The irony wasn't lost on me that I understood the tactical significance of his heroics better than anyone in our family, could analyze the split-second decisions that had made the difference between life and death for men whose names I would never know. But understanding Marcus's courage intellectually and feeling connected to it emotionally were different things entirely. His heroism existed in the sunlit world of public recognition and official commendations, a world where actions had witnesses and consequences were acknowledged. My world was different. My world was composed of classified briefings and anonymous recommendations, of systems that worked precisely because no one knew they existed, of threats that were neutralized so quietly that the people being protected never realized they had been in danger. I thought about the last conversation Marcus and I had shared 3 months before his death. He'd been home on leave, restless and distant in the way that had become familiar after his 3rd deployment. We'd found ourselves alone in the kitchen late one night, both of us unable to sleep, both reaching for the same bottle of wine that had been opened during another one of our parents' political dinner parties. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like," he'd said, staring into his glass as if it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate, "to do something important that no one ever heard about. To make a difference without all the ceremony and recognition." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and seen something I'd never noticed before. The weight of being constantly visible, constantly celebrated, constantly expected to live up to an image that had been built around him since childhood. For just a moment, I'd considered telling him about my work, about the projects that kept me awake at night, not from stress, but from the intellectual satisfaction of solving problems that could save thousands of lives. But the moment had passed. He'd finished his wine, clapped me on the shoulder in the brotherly way that maintained affection while preserving distance, and headed to bed. I sat there in the dark kitchen, wondering what might have been different if I'd been brave enough to bridge the gap between our 2 worlds, if I'd trusted him enough to share the secret that defined my professional life. Now he was dead, and that conversation would remain forever unfinished, forever hypothetical. The what-ifs were almost harder to bear than the grief itself. The funeral director was reading from a prepared statement now, listing the military honors that would be presented posthumously to Captain Hartwell's memory: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, each medal a testament to courage that had been witnessed, documented, officially recognized. I found myself calculating the mathematical probability of survival in the situations that had earned him those decorations, my engineer's mind automatically processing the variables that had allowed him to live long enough to receive them. It was a cruel irony that the sister who had been overlooked her entire life was the one who understood the technical aspects of modern warfare well enough to appreciate exactly how remarkable his survival had been. I knew the failure rates of communication equipment in desert environments, understood the logistics of ammunition resupply under fire, could calculate the precise angles that made the difference between effective cover and deadly exposure for men whose names I would never know. But understanding Marcus's courage intellectually and feeling connected to it emotionally were different things entirely. His heroism existed in the sunlit world of public recognition and official commendations, a world where actions had witnesses and consequences were acknowledged. My world was different. My world was composed of classified briefings and anonymous recommendations, of systems that worked precisely because no one knew they existed, of threats that were neutralized so quietly that the people being protected never realized they had been in danger. The woman beside me shifted in her folding chair, and I realized she was crying. She was elderly, probably in her 80s, with the carefully maintained appearance of someone who had been beautiful in her youth and had never quite accepted that time had moved on. Her tears were quiet and dignified, the kind that spoke to deep personal loss rather than general sympathy for the deceased. I wondered who she was, what connection she had to Marcus that had earned her a place in this gathering of official mourners. Had she been a family friend, a neighbor who had watched him grow up, a teacher who had recognized his potential early? Or was she like me, someone whose relationship to Marcus was real, but unacknowledged, relegated to the margins of his story despite having played a significant role in shaping it? The pastor at Marcus's funeral was speaking now, about courage and sacrifice, his voice echoing through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. He painted a picture of my brother as a man who had lived without fear, who had charged headfirst into danger to protect his fellow Marines, who embodied everything noble about the American spirit. The congregation murmured their agreement, a choreographed symphony of grief and admiration that made my chest tighten with familiar loneliness. Marcus had been brave. There was no questioning that. The silver star on his dress uniform wasn't ceremonial. It represented actions in the Battle of Marja that had saved the lives of 6 Marines trapped by enemy fire. I'd read the citation online, printed it out, kept it in my desk drawer at work where I could look at it during the long hours I spent designing systems that would keep other people's brothers safe. The irony wasn't lost on me that I understood the tactical significance of his heroics better than anyone in our family, could analyze the split-second decisions that had made the difference between life and death for men whose names I would never know. But understanding Marcus's courage intellectually and feeling connected to it emotionally were different things entirely. His heroism existed in the sunlit world of public recognition and official commendations, a world where actions had witnesses and consequences were acknowledged. My world was different. My world was composed of classified briefings and anonymous recommendations, of systems that worked precisely because no one knew they existed, of threats that were neutralized so quietly that the people being protected never realized they had been in danger. I thought about the last conversation Marcus and I had shared 3 months before his death. He'd been home on leave, restless and distant in the way that had become familiar after his 3rd deployment. We'd found ourselves alone in the kitchen late one night, both of us unable to sleep, both reaching for the same bottle of wine that had been opened during another one of our parents' political dinner parties. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like," he'd said, staring into his glass as if it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate, "to do something important that no one ever heard about. To make a difference without all the ceremony and recognition." I'd looked at him then, really looked at him, and seen something I'd never noticed before. The weight of being constantly visible, constantly celebrated, constantly expected to live up to an image that had been built around him since childhood. For just a moment, I'd considered. The realization should have made me angry, but instead, it just made me tired. This was how our family had always functioned, how my parents had always understood the world. Value was determined by recognition, worth was measured by public acknowledgement, and importance was calculated based on how many significant people knew your name. It was a worldview that had served them well in politics and social climbing, but it had left no room for a daughter whose significance operated in the shadows, whose achievements could never be publicly celebrated, whose worth was measured in lives saved rather than votes earned. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on what Marcus would have wanted, rather than what was actually happening around his coffin. He would have wanted to be remembered for his courage, for his dedication to his fellow Marines, for his willingness to put others' safety before his own. He would have wanted his death to mean something, to inspire others to similar service, to stand as testimony to the values he had lived and died defending. But would he have wanted this spectacle, this careful choreography of political grief, this gathering of people who were there to be seen rather than to genuinely mourn? I wasn't sure. The Marcus I had known, in the brief moments when his public persona dropped and his authentic self emerged, had been quieter than this, more thoughtful,
more interested in substance than ceremony. The Marcus I remembered from our childhood had been the boy who spent hours building elaborate constructions with blocks and toy soldiers, creating complex scenarios where he could test different strategies and outcomes. He'd been methodical and analytical, always trying to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened and how it could be improved. That intellectual curiosity had served him well in military training, had made him the kind of officer who thought through problems rather than simply following standard procedures. But somewhere along the way, that thoughtful boy had been subsumed into the public image of Marcus Hartwell, war hero and golden child. The real person had become secondary to the symbol. And even I had started to relate to the symbol rather than the brother I had grown up with. It was easier, in some ways, to admire the decorated Marine than to grieve for the complicated human being who had carried that decoration. The pastor was inviting people to share memories now, and a steady stream of speakers made their way to the podium. His commanding officer spoke with professional respect about Marcus's natural leadership abilities. His college roommate told an amusing story about late-night study sessions fueled by terrible coffee and competitive determination. A childhood friend recalled how Marcus had organized neighborhood football games that included even the most athletically challenged kids, making everyone feel valuable and included. Each story painted the same picture. Marcus as protector, Marcus as leader, Marcus as someone who made the world better just by being in it. And sitting in my folding chair in the back row, I found myself thinking about all the stories that would never be told, all the ways his life had intersected with mine that no one in this cathedral would ever know or understand. I thought about the night when we were 12 and 10, respectively, when I'd been struggling with a particularly complex math problem for a school competition. Marcus had found me crying over my homework at the kitchen table, frustrated by concepts that seemed to dance just beyond my understanding. Instead of dismissing my tears or suggesting I ask our parents for help, he'd sat down beside me and worked through the problem step by step, his patience infinite and his encouragement genuine. "You're smarter than you think you are, Soph," he'd said, using the childhood nickname that he'd never shared with anyone else. "Sometimes the hardest problems just need a different angle. Don't give up on yourself." I'd won that math competition, and Marcus had been genuinely proud, not in the performative way that had characterized so many of our family interactions, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped another person achieve their potential. Our parents had acknowledged the victory with polite congratulations and a brief mention in their Christmas letter, but Marcus had understood that it represented something more significant. Proof that his strange, bookish sister had abilities that deserved recognition and development. But that story wouldn't be told at his funeral. The memory of his patience, his insight into my potential, his willingness to see value in academic achievement that our parents found incomprehensible, all of that would remain private, known only to me. The public Marcus was the one that mattered at gatherings like this. The Marcus whose accomplishments could be easily understood and appropriately celebrated by people who measured worth in conventional terms. Another speaker was approaching the podium now, a woman in an army dress uniform whose bearing suggested high rank and significant responsibility. I didn't recognize her, but something about her presence commanded attention in a way that went beyond mere military courtesy. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, but there was also a warmth that suggested personal connection rather than professional obligation. Captain Hartwell and I never served together directly, but our paths crossed several times during joint operations in Afghanistan. What struck me most about Marcus wasn't his tactical skill, though that was considerable, or his courage under fire, though that was beyond question. What impressed me was his understanding that military success depended on more than just the people carrying weapons. She paused, her eyes scanning the congregation, as if looking for someone in particular. Marcus understood that modern warfare is a complex system involving intelligence analysts, communications specialists, logistics coordinators, and countless other support personnel whose contributions are essential, but often invisible. He never forgot that his ability to focus on combat operations depended on other people handling the details that made mission success possible. I felt my breath catch as I realized she was talking about the invisible infrastructure of military operations, the network of specialists and analysts who worked behind the scenes to ensure that field officers like Marcus could do their jobs effectively. It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging that there might be family members whose service took different forms, whose contributions operated in different spheres, but were equally vital to the mission of protecting American lives. I mention this because I think it's important to remember that heroism comes in many forms. Marcus's courage was visible and rightly celebrated, but it was supported by countless acts of less visible but equally important service. His legacy includes not just his own achievements, but his recognition of all the people who made those achievements possible. The words seemed to hang in the air as she returned to her seat, and I found myself wondering if she had known somehow, if someone had briefed her on the family dynamics that made her comments particularly resonant. But that seemed impossible. My work was compartmentalized beyond anything most military officers would have clearance to know about, and there was no obvious reason why anyone would have connected my professional activities to Marcus's funeral. More likely, she was simply a thoughtful person who understood that military families came in many configurations, that service and sacrifice weren't always visible or publicly acknowledged. Her comments weren't specifically about me, but they created space for people like me, recognition that heroism existed in forms that didn't always fit conventional narratives. The service was beginning to wind down now, the formal prayers and ceremonial elements that would conclude Marcus's public memorial. Soon, we would proceed to Arlington National Cemetery, where the burial would take place with full military honors. I dreaded that part of the day, knowing that I would again be relegated to the margins, watching from a distance as my brother was laid at rest with ceremony that acknowledged his public service while ignoring the private relationships that had shaped his character. But as the congregation began to stir, preparing for the move outside, something unexpected happened.
There was a commotion near the front of the cathedral, a subtle shift in the crowd that suggested something unplanned was taking place. I craned my neck to see over the heads of the people in front of me, but from my position in the back row, it was impossible to make out what was happening. Then I saw them, a group of soldiers in army dress uniforms, moving against the flow of the departing congregation with purposeful determination. Their bearing was so crisp, their sense of mission so obvious, that people automatically stepped aside to let them pass. They weren't casual attendees or honorary participants. These were men with orders, moving toward a specific objective, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested official business. My heart began to race as I realized they were heading directly toward my section of the cathedral. There was something about their movement, their obvious sense of purpose, that sent adrenaline coursing through my system. These weren't mourners offering condolences or officials paying routine respects. These were soldiers executing a mission, and that mission apparently involved the forgotten corner of the cathedral where the unimportant family members had been seated. The crowd parted before them like water, senators and congressmen stepping aside to make way for whatever official business had brought these men to Marcus's funeral. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, conversations stopping as people tried to understand what was happening, why active-duty military personnel were moving with such obvious purpose through a civilian ceremony. And then they stopped, directly in front of me. 6 soldiers in perfect formation, their eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made everything else in the cathedral fade into irrelevance. The man in the center, clearly their commanding officer, took a single step forward and performed an action that challenged every assumption I had ever made about my place in this family, this world, this life. He saluted me. Not a casual acknowledgement or a gesture of general respect, but a slow, deliberate, picture-perfect military salute that held with the kind of precision reserved for superior officers. And as he maintained that salute, his voice rang out clear and unmistakable across the suddenly silent cathedral. "General, ma'am."
The words seemed to echo in the vast space, bouncing off stone walls and stained glass windows before settling into a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. General. The title hung between us like a bridge I had never expected to cross, connecting two worlds that I had spent my entire adult life keeping carefully separate. I felt my legs wobble, not from weakness, but from the sheer impossibility of what was happening. Colonels and generals didn't attend the funerals of distant relatives. They didn't seek out obscure government contractors in the back rows of civilian ceremonies. They certainly didn't perform formal military courtesies for people whose work was supposed to be invisible, compartmentalized, separate from the public face of national defense. My father's face had gone completely white. From where I stood, I could see him turning in his front row pew, his mouth slightly open in an expression of pure confusion that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Senator William Hartwell, a man who prided himself on never being caught off guard by political developments, looked like he was watching the fundamental laws of reality reorganize themselves before his eyes. The man holding the salute was a colonel, I realized, noting the eagles on his collar. Colonel James Morrison, according to the nameplate on his uniform. When he finally dropped his salute, his eyes never left mine. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind of authority that came from knowing exactly whom he was addressing and why he was here. Ma'am, I have orders to escort you to the front of this service. Your brother's funeral is not complete without you in your proper place. Orders. The word hit me like cold water, cutting through my shock and confusion with crystalline clarity. In my world, orders meant something specific and non-negotiable. Orders came from people who understood the true weight of situations that appeared simple on the surface, from decision-makers who had access to information that explained actions that seemed inexplicable to outside observers. Someone with the authority to give orders to a colonel had decided that my presence at the front of Marcus's funeral was not just appropriate, but essential. Someone had determined that the invisible sister belonged in the visible seats, that the family member who had been dismissed and overlooked for 34 years deserved official recognition and ceremonial honor. But I couldn't move. My feet felt welded to the floor of the cathedral, anchored by decades of being told I didn't belong in moments like this, that my place was in the background, that my contributions were valuable precisely because they remained hidden. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Soldiers treating me with the respect usually reserved for high-ranking officials, public recognition for work that was supposed to remain classified, acknowledgement from strangers of worth that my own family had never recognized. Colonel Morrison seemed to understand my hesitation. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear him above the stunned whispers that were beginning to ripple through the crowd. Ma'am, there are things about your service that your family needs to understand, things that your brother died knowing, even if he never got the chance to share them. We're here to make sure he gets the send-off he deserves, and that includes having his sister where she belongs. Your service. The phrase sent electricity through my nervous system, confirming what I had begun to suspect, that these soldiers knew something about my professional life that extended far beyond publicly available information. They weren't here based on mistaken identity or bureaucratic confusion. They were here because someone with access to classified information had made a deliberate decision to bridge the gap between my hidden professional identity and my public family role. My work was supposed to be compartmentalized, existing in secure facilities that were completely separate from my personal life. The projects I worked on officially didn't exist. The systems I designed had designations rather than names, and the crises I helped prevent were never acknowledged in any public forum. My security clearances came with obligations that included maintaining complete separation between professional and personal identities, never allowing the two worlds to intersect in ways that could compromise operational effectiveness. But somehow, these soldiers knew. They knew enough to be here, enough to address me by a rank that existed only in the most classified corners of the defense establishment, enough to understand that my relationship to Marcus extended far beyond typical family dynamics into realms of national security and military operations.
The funeral director approached Colonel Morrison with the nervous deference of a civilian who recognized military authority even when he didn't understand its source or purpose. "Colonel, I need to ask you to maintain order during the service.
The family has made specific arrangements, and we need to respect their wishes during this difficult time." Morrison's response was swift and uncompromising. "Sir, the family's wishes are not my concern. My orders come from the Pentagon, and they take precedence over any civilian arrangements. Dr. Hartwell will take her proper place at this service, and that place is in the front row with immediate family. I suggest you make the necessary adjustments quickly and quietly." The Pentagon. The word rippled through the congregation like wildfire, and I could see people beginning to reach for phones, though the soldiers' presence seemed to discourage any actual photography. Pentagon involvement meant this was more than a family dispute over seating arrangements. It meant someone at the highest levels of military command had decided that my presence at Marcus's funeral carried implications that extended beyond personal grief into matters of official policy. My father was moving toward us now, his politician's instincts finally overcoming his initial shock. He walked with the careful, measured steps of someone trying to maintain dignity while navigating completely unfamiliar territory. When he reached our small group, he attempted to assert the kind of authority that had served him well in the Senate, but suddenly felt inadequate in the face of military precision. "Colonel Morrison, I'm Senator William Hartwell, Marcus's father. I believe there's been some misunderstanding. My daughter Sophia works for the government, yes, but she's a civilian contractor. She's an engineer, not a military officer. There must be confusion about her status or security clearance." The look Colonel Morrison gave my father managed to be both respectful and completely dismissive at the same time. It was the expression of a man who had been thoroughly briefed on a situation from angles that civilians couldn't access, who understood connections and implications that existed far above the security clearance level of even a United States senator. "Senator Hartwell, with all due respect, there is no confusion about your daughter's status. The confusion lies in your understanding of what her service to this country has actually involved. Dr. Hartwell's contributions to national defense are as significant as any uniformed officer's, and she deserves to be recognized as such at her brother's funeral." He gestured to the other soldiers, who immediately formed a corridor that created a clear path from where I stood to the front of the cathedral. The maneuver was executed with seamless coordination that spoke to extensive training and absolute mutual trust. These weren't ceremonial guards or honorary escorts. These were operational soldiers who had worked together on missions that required this level of precision and unity. "Ma'am," Colonel Morrison said, turning back to me, "if you would allow us to escort you to your seat. This service cannot proceed properly without you where you belong." The word belong resonated through me like a tuning fork struck against stone. Belonging. After 34 years of existing in the spaces between other people's achievements, of being the family member who could be safely overlooked because her contributions were incomprehensible to those who mattered, I was being told that I belonged at the center of attention, that my presence was not just welcome, but essential. But even as part of me wanted to accept this unprecedented recognition, another part of me was terrified by the implications. Public acknowledgement of my work could compromise ongoing operations, could expose methods and capabilities that were effective precisely because they remained hidden. The systems I designed worked because adversaries didn't know they existed. The analyses I provided were valuable because they were based on information sources that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Colonel," I managed, finding my voice, despite the surreal nature of the situation, "I need to understand what's happening here. My work is classified at levels that should prevent this kind of public recognition. There must be protocols being violated, security considerations that make this inadvisable." Morrison's expression softened slightly, acknowledging the legitimacy of my concerns while maintaining his absolute certainty about the appropriateness of his actions. "Ma'am, the decision to acknowledge your service publicly was made at the highest levels of government, with full consideration of all security implications. Today's recognition has been specifically authorized and carefully planned to honor both your brother's sacrifice and your own contributions, without compromising ongoing operations." Highest levels of government. The phrase suggested involvement from officials whose names appeared on documents that would remain classified for decades, people who understood the full scope of threats facing the nation and the complete range of responses being deployed to address those threats. Someone had decided that my brother's funeral provided an opportunity to acknowledge civilian contributions to national defense in a way that was normally impossible, using the tragedy of his death to illuminate achievements that usually remained invisible. My mother had joined us now, her face displaying the controlled panic of someone whose carefully managed public image was being disrupted by variables she couldn't predict or control. Eleanor Hartwell had built her identity around managing public appearances, ensuring that every public interaction reflected appropriate dignity and status. This unprecedented intrusion of unknown factors into what should have been a choreographed ceremony of grief was her worst nightmare manifesting in real time. Sophia, dear, perhaps we should step outside and discuss this privately. I'm sure these gentlemen have important business, but this isn't the appropriate time or place for whatever official matters they need to address with you. But Colonel Morrison was already shaking his head before she finished speaking. Mrs. Hartwell, this is exactly the appropriate time and place. Your son gave his life in service to his country. Part of honoring that sacrifice is acknowledging all the ways his family has served alongside him, even when that service has necessarily remained hidden. He paused, his gaze encompassing both my parents as he continued. Your daughter's work has prevented more American casualties than most people realize.
Her systems have kept soldiers like your son alive in situations where survival depended on having better information than the enemy. She deserves recognition not as a courtesy to grieving relatives, but as acknowledgement of genuine achievement in service of national security. The words hung in the cathedral air like incense, carrying weight that went beyond their literal meaning. This wasn't charity or misguided sympathy. This was official recognition based on concrete achievements that could be measured in lives saved, conflicts prevented, resources protected. The invisible daughter was being revealed as someone whose contributions had been seen, evaluated, and deemed worthy of the highest honors, even if those honors had previously been awarded only in classified ceremonies that left no public record. I looked around the cathedral one final time, taking in the sea of faces that had turned toward our small drama in what had been the forgotten corner of the church just minutes before. Politicians and dignitaries, business leaders and military officers, all the people who had shaped my family's world for as long as I could remember, were watching to see what I would do with this unprecedented offer of recognition. For the first time in my adult life, I realized that their opinions didn't matter to me. The only judgments that carried weight were those of the soldiers standing before me, men who understood service and sacrifice, who knew that heroism took many forms, and that the most important contributions often remained invisible until circumstances made acknowledgement both possible and necessary. I took a deep breath, feeling something fundamental shift inside me like geological plates finding new equilibrium after an earthquake. When I spoke, my voice was stronger than it had been all day, clearer than it had been in years of family gatherings where I felt like a visitor in my own blood relations. Colonel Morrison, if you believe I belong in the front row, then I accept your escort. If my presence there honors my brother's memory and acknowledges service we've both given to this country, then I'm ready to take my proper place. The smile that crossed his face was like sunrise after the longest night of winter. Yes, ma'am. Please follow us. The procession that followed felt like walking through a lucid dream. Every step surreal, but undeniably real. The 6 soldiers formed a perfect honor guard around me, their synchronized movement creating a rhythm that seemed to echo off the cathedral's stone walls. As we moved down the center aisle, I could feel every eye in the building tracking our progress, could hear whispered conversations starting up in our wake as people tried to process what they were witnessing. But for the first time in my life, the attention didn't make me want to disappear into the nearest wall. Instead, it felt like the merging from underwater, like finally being able to breathe after holding my breath for 3 decades. These people were seeing me, really seeing me, not as the disappointing daughter or the forgotten sister, but as someone worthy of respect and recognition in my own right. When we reached the front of the cathedral, Colonel Morrison gestured toward an empty space in the first pew that had been carefully reserved for immediate family only. It was directly beside where Marcus's flag-draped casket rested, close enough that I could see the perfect folds of red, white, and blue fabric that covered my brother's final rest.
"Ma'am," the colonel said quietly, "this is where you belong. This is where your brother would have wanted you." As I settled into the seat that had been denied to me an hour earlier, I felt something I had never experienced before. The complete absence of doubt about my right to be exactly where I was. The soldiers took positions along the cathedral walls, their presence serving as silent testimony that this recognition carried the full weight of institutional authority. The Reverend approached his podium with visible uncertainty, clearly thrown by the unexpected interruption to his carefully planned service, but before he could speak, Colonel Morrison stepped forward and cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room he entered. "Reverend, if I may, there are additional honors that need to be presented before we continue with the service." Additional honors. The phrase sent anticipation through the congregation because everyone understood that whatever was coming next would complete the transformation of this funeral from a private family ceremony into something much larger and more significant. Colonel Morrison reached into his dress uniform jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio that he opened with the kind of ceremonial care usually reserved for the most solemn military rituals. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral sound system and reaching every corner of the vast space. "It is my privilege to read a citation that has been classified until this moment, authorized for public release only upon the death of Captain Marcus Hartwell and only in the presence of his immediate family." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. Even the infants in the congregation appeared to sense that something momentous was about to occur. Colonel Morrison held the citation document high enough for everyone to see the official seals and signatures that marked it as genuine government correspondence of the highest importance. The citation reads, "For exceptional and sustained service to the United States of America in the design, implementation, and oversight of advanced defense systems that have directly contributed to the safety and operational success of American military personnel worldwide, Dr. Sophia Marie Hartwell is hereby awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat decoration that can be bestowed upon a civilian by the Department of Defense." Dr. Sophia Marie Hartwell. Hearing my full name spoken with the same reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients was disorienting and thrilling simultaneously. The academic title that my family had dismissed as bureaucratic pretension was being announced with the gravity appropriate to someone whose work had shaped national security policy at the highest levels. But Colonel Morrison was far from finished. He continued reading from the official citation, his voice growing more intense with each revealed detail of my professional achievements. "Dr. Hartwell's innovations in predictive threat analysis have prevented an estimated 23 separate international incidents that modeling suggests would have escalated into armed conflicts involving American forces. Her development of advanced logistics optimization systems has reduced supply chain vulnerabilities that previously exposed forward deployed units to unnecessary risk. Her creation of integrated communication protocols has enhanced coordination between military and intelligence services, resulting in more effective responses to emerging threats. 23 prevented conflicts. The number seemed to hang in the cathedral air.